thank Sean as well for the invitation. I'm very much enjoying the papers. They've been excellent so far. Very much enjoying the conversation. Recently, I have experienced the science fiction-like sensation of living in parallel universes, each employing a similar conceptual language, but whose residents don't seem to know their doubles elsewhere. So on the one hand, political and social philosophy has witnessed a remarkable revival of realist political philosophy, spearheaded by major figures like Raymond Geuss and the late Bernard Williams. On the other hand, political science, and especially international political theory, has undergone a no less impressive revival of research about international realism, often inspired by attempts to rethink the conventional and particularly Waltzian account of the proper trajectory of realist theory. Of course, many of the people in this room have been involved in that renaissance. Nonetheless, the two universes seem pretty much unknown to each other, at least as far as I can tell. Those working in IR realism haven't paid attention to the realist revival in political philosophy. The political philosophers, of course, have either ignored or caricatured international realism. Only Geuss, as far as I can tell, has really acknowledged its existence. But he never deals very seriously with it. From his perspective, international realism, he mentions Morgenthau in passing on a couple of occasions, represents nothing more than a warmed-over variety of amoral realpolitik with a crude political ethics. You've heard that before, right? His assessment reproduces precisely the sort of one-sided interpretation of realism which so much recent scholarship in IR has tried to challenge. Despite his historical and contextual approach to political philosophy, which in many ways is admirable, he has no interest in recent international theory or in novel attempts to retell realism's historical story. Today, what I want to try to do is suggest that this neglect of IR realism has come at a high price. Stated in the bluntest terms, so here's my central thesis this morning. At best, recent philosophical-minded realists reproduce conceptual ambiguities that plagued earlier IR realists like Morgenthau. At worst, they fall behind some of its most important achievements. New is not always better. I'm not convinced that the new realists ultimately have advanced that much beyond the old realists, and by that I'm thinking of classical realism in particular. So first of all, let me say a bit about Geuss and Williams. Given all of your knowledge of international realism, it's not going to be very hard for you to get a handle on what they are up to, even though obviously I can't get into all the nuances today. Their main target is contemporary neo-Kantianism, and especially John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. They're the bad guys. In the simplest terms, they accuse the neo-Kantians of reducing politics to applied ethics. Allegedly, Rawls and Habermas start with idealized, rationalistic, and socially harmonistic moral ideas, Rawls' veil of ignorance, Habermas' ideal speech situation, and then allegedly they go and mechanically deduce their political theories from those moral notions. As a result, supposedly they cannot deal with the autonomy of the political sphere, and they can't deal with the harsh realities of political life. For the realist, it's messy, it's historically contingent, it's plagued by conflict, power inequality, and the specter of violence. Neo-Kantianism represents a form of moralism, which gets in the way of proper political thinking, including, and I mentioned this at many different junctures, a suitable theory of political judgment, as well as a sound political ethics. Because the neo-Kantians allegedly are implicitly committed to a view of social life which privileges general rules and general regularities, they also succumb to legalism. They ignore Thomas Hobbes' great insight that social life, I quote, this comes from Geuss, is always potentially disrupted, unstable, and conflict-ridden, end quote. Not surprisingly, the neo-Kantians downplay the politically tendentious character of universal human rights, which Geuss, in striking contrast to someone like Habermas, for example, rather bluntly and dismissively describes as, I quote, a kind of puffery or white magic. Now let me just say for the moment that I think there's a lot of caricature in this critique, in particular with Geuss. There's a lot to be said here. For example, he makes all sorts of rather dismissive comments about Habermas. He wrote a book on critical theory, as perhaps you know. The book is very much out of date. It was written in the early 1980s. You would not get the impression from his recent writings that Habermas' views have changed in any sort of way since about 1977. So I think there are some real issues. Half-truths get mixed in, at least as far as I'm concerned, with some of the nonsense. We can talk more about this if you'd like to during the discussion period. But for now, I just want you to get a handle on what they're For them, realism represents the perfect antidote to this terrible neo-Kantian cancer that now plagues political thinking and political practice. Realism doesn't start with highfalutin, rationalistic moral ideas. Instead, it starts with how things really stand. This is what Royce says. It starts with political realities, and fundamentally, political realities, again, are about conflict, power, and violence. In this way, it respects the autonomy of politics. The realist always zooms in on the key question of whom. This is what Royce says. In other words, who does what to whom for whose benefit. With Hobbes, realism takes the fragility of political order seriously. So Williams says that the primary or fundamental question of politics is always the Hobbesian one. For there to be life in the first place, there has to be order, there has to be protection, there has to be safety. And they have to be secured by means of a political order which monopolizes legitimate coercion. However, the realists allegedly are not thereby hostile to normative reflection. In fact, this is how they think they are different from the IR realists. They just think it has to be bottoms up. This is the expression they like to use. It has to be grounded or based in political reality, rather than applied to politics from some sort of external moral standpoint. That's what they think the neo-Kantians are doing. In this spirit, Williams tries to derive a normatively robust account of legitimacy from some basic political facts. And as I'll explain in just a moment, he thinks you can start with Hobbes, but ultimately go beyond Hobbes in terms of laying out some ambitious conception of political legitimacy. When discussing political ethics, the realists typically turn to Weber. His ethic of responsibility, in contrast to neo-Kantianism, is the way to go, they say, since it takes the moral paradoxes of political action, especially the fact of political violence, seriously. Now, there clearly is a lot of thematic overlap here with IR realism, and especially, I would argue, with classical IR realism. Even if the specific arguments differ, which they often do, for obvious reasons, many of the theoretical preoccupations are quite similar. I don't want to say too much about this overlap right now, because I suspect that it's probably pretty clear to you, given even my rather short summary. Instead, what I want to do is show how and why the new realism at best reproduces some earlier problems within realism, and at worst, again, falls behind the achievements of Morgenthau, Niebuhr, and others. So let me start first with how it regresses. Royce tells us that the best way, I quote, to make discernible progress in political philosophy is by studying history, social and economic institutions, and the real world of politics, end quote. Indeed, the new realism is supposedly characterized by its attempt, again, here's a quote from Royce, to start from an account of our existing motivations and our political and social institutions, and not from a set of abstract moral rights, end of quote. In order to get a realistic theory of politics, realism starts with an empirically sound account of human psychology and institutions. In part, Royce goes on to say, because politics depends to a great extent on judging what is actual relative to what is possible. Now again, those of you familiar, which is basically everybody in the room, with mid-century IR realism will not be surprised by this basic move. Earlier realists also turned, at least implicitly, to psychology, think of Morgenthau's interest in Freud, and philosophical anthropology, to develop a useful account of what the new realists now call human motivation. Early IR realism was also initially defined by a parallel quest to challenge especially Kelson's neo-Kantian legal theory, which Morgenthau and others thought unfairly neglected. Morgenthau in 1940 in a very important article called The Sociological Context, Social Tensions and Aspirations for Power. In this early formulation of realism, it aspired to offer a sociological or social scientific corrective thinking to Kelson's neo-Kantian theory, which, as you perhaps know, had envisioned law as a system of norms neatly separable from sociological or social scientific inquiry on the one hand, and then ethics on the other hand. In the view of early realists like Morgenthau, neo-Kantians like Kelsen thereby distorted key attributes of modern international politics, leaving us with an unreal portrayal of international law and the political and social conditions under which it operated. As you all know, mid-century realists then proceeded to produce a massive body of writings where they developed complicated social scientific analysis of international politics. Much of this work was devoted to developing a rigorous empirical account of institutions. Some of it, as I already mentioned, relied at least implicitly on psychology and philosophical anthropology. Because so much of it took the form of empirical analysis, its underlying normative inclinations were often neglected, yet theirs nonetheless remained a normatively inspired theory because, like Geuss, they understood that you need to, that what one has to do is judge what is actual relative to what is possible if one wants to change things. Despite this common starting point, the new realists have yet to offer, as far as I can tell, anything approaching the impressive empirical account of real-life institutions in psychology provided by the IR realists. Even though they repeatedly underscore the importance of discussing real politics, they say this again and again and again, they never actually do so. At the very least, they rarely transcend political punditry. That's what they do. There's a lot of punditry sort of mixed in with comments about Nietzsche and Hegel and so on. Now, even for those of us with an ecumenical conception of social scientific research, it's very difficult to see how they have yet to provide a satisfactory analysis of political and social realities. Notwithstanding their attack on moralistic neo-Kantianism, contemporary realists themselves rarely have moved beyond offering their own primarily normative and moral philosophical response to it. At least on this matter, mid-century IR was much more IR realism was much more successful. It criticized Kelson's neo-Kantianism, but then it went on to offer an alternative perspective in which political realities were, of course, the subject of systematic empirical analysis. I raised this point with my philosopher friends. They don't seem to be bothered by this at all. And they think social science is, I don't know, secondary significance. And I share some of those concerns about social science, but this is quite striking. This lacuna seems to me is really striking for a theory that wants to talk about reality. If I'm not mistaken, there may be some internal theoretical reasons for this gap in Geuss and Williams. They rely on an astonishingly broad range of intellectual legacies in constructing the new realism. These are the precursors they mentioned to realism, their realism. Adorno, Hobbes, Lenin, Lukács, Marx, Nietzsche, Sitter, Schmidt, Weber, Wittgenstein, even the late Judith Scheuerman. No wonder they have a hard time outlining a satisfactory account of institution, psychology, and power relations. The early realists were also somewhat eclectic, but I think this goes well beyond what you'll find in someone like Morgenthau. Each of the figures whom I just mentioned can be easily interpreted as suggesting competing and probably inconsistent places to turn on to best make sense of political and social realities. Until contemporary realists provide a more satisfactory account of which perspectives on power, institutions, and motivations are most tenable, I don't think they're going to be able to move beyond their vague and I think unsatisfactory call for a more realistic political theory. Now let me say something about how the new realists reproduce some of the problems which plagued IR realism. As I mentioned, the new realists want to defend the idea of politics as a distinct and autonomous sphere of activity. This is actually very important for what they do. They also think we have to avoid endorsing an amoral version of realism. Again, that's how they think. In other words, we have to take the autonomy of politics seriously, but we have to do so while without discounting morality, or if you prefer, without losing a normative conception of politics. Now, this should sound familiar to everybody here. Go back again, look at Morgenthau's famous, or perhaps infamous, 6 principles of realism. Guess what? He's struggling with precisely this sort of question there, and also obviously many other places. There he described politics, I quote, as an independent sphere of action and understanding apart from other spheres, such as economics, ethics, aesthetics. So politics represents, in this formulation, an autonomous sphere of action. Realism, he says there, takes this autonomy seriously. In contrast, the moralist, this is what Morgenthau then goes on and says, as you'll remember, takes the autonomy and independent logic of a separate moral sphere no less seriously. So how then should we conceive of the relationship between morality and politics within realism? Well, I think if you look at Morgenthau's 1954 comments, they moved rather confusingly in 2 different directions. On the one hand, he comments, I quote, "The political realist is not unaware of the existence and relevance of standards of thought other than the political one. As political realist, however, he cannot but subordinate these other standards to the political one," end of quote. So in this formulation, realism entails not only proper appreciation for the autonomy of politics, but for the subordination of moral concerns to it. Indeed, in the 6 principles, sometimes he juxtaposes the realist to the moralist, as though they were these 2 different figures, basically. On the other hand, Morgenthau also declares, again I quote, "The realist defense of the autonomy of politics does not imply disregard for the existence and importance of these other modes of thought, including morality. Elsewhere, he actually said, a much stronger formulation, morality is not just another branch of human action, coordinate to the substantive branches such as politics and economics. To the contrary, it is superimposed on them, limiting the choice of ends and means. So apparently, in this formulation, morality should be seen as superimposed on politics. In the same spirit, he frequently described purely political creatures, for example, a pure, real politician, preoccupied with nothing but the accumulation of power, as a moral monster. It's not something to be imitated. Actually, Hitler, for him, is an example of somebody who did that. Now, for reasons I can't fully get into today, I think his political ethics, in fact, demanded of political actors that they heed moral imperatives and minimize the evils of political action. I'm echoing other things you've heard today. In the final analysis, the second set of statements I just quoted better captures what he ultimately was up to. But it's not an accident that he and so many other IR realists have been read as celebrating a moral power of politics, even if this misconstrues, I think, they do. One source of this misunderstanding now seems to me at least clear enough. Faced with what they consider to be a widespread anti-political tendency within political thought and practice, the IR realists sometimes latch on to a potentially misleading idea of politics as this independent sphere of action, somehow different fundamentally from competing spheres of action, including morality. I think this opened the door to this problematic attempt to envision morality as something other. The idiosyncratic notion of social life as carved up into separate spheres of activity, which probably, by the way, came from old Carl Schmitt, with whom, as you all know, Morgenthau engaged at great length, left Morgenthau on occasion with this problematic image of politics as fundamentally different from, or unrelated to, morality. Now let's fast forward to the present, where we encounter realist political philosophers, again frustrated by contemporary liberalism's allegedly anti-political instincts. Guess what? They reproduce the efforts of earlier IR realists to conceive of politics as a basically autonomous sphere of action. Not surprisingly, perhaps, they also reproduce some of these earlier conceptual problems. Like Morgenthau, at least at some times like Morgenthau, the new realists have a hard time offering, I think, a coherent account of the relationship between politics and morality. Now, I think this is most obvious with Geuss, who, despite his claim that contemporary realism differs from its forerunner by taking morality seriously, in fact, never really outlines, again, as far as I can tell, maybe I've just missed it, a systematic account of the relationship between politics and morality. The fact that he enthusiastically endorses Nietzsche's critique of Western moral universalism will hardly reassure at least some of us struggling to figure out how realism can be linked to a robust conception of morality rather than to mere power politics. And that's the move he ultimately takes. He thinks you can buy into a lot of Nietzsche and still have a sufficiently robust moral theory. Now, a lot could be said, a lot needs to be said about this, but for now, let me just point out that there might be some legitimate worries one might entertain about the sort of post-Nietzschean moral theory Geuss apparently has in mind, certainly Morgenthau would have avoided that sort of thing, I think. Whether or not it can provide political realism with a satisfying moral theory remains, at least to me, an open question. As for Williams, he not only highlights the distinctiveness of politics, but also refers appreciatively to some of Schmitt's ideas. He says that politics is indeed about friends and enemies, which, again, I quote, is basically true in one sense. Political difference is of the essence of politics. Political difference is a relation of political opposition, rather than, as allegedly the neo-Kantians claim, a relation of intellectual or interpretive disagreement. End quote. Having bought into the idea of politics as a distinct sphere of action, defined by its own internal and basically autonomous standards, which seems to be some version of the friend-foe criterion, he then faces the same puzzle encountered by Morgenthau. How should we understand the relationship of politics to morality? His answer relies on claiming that normative principles can be effectively deduced from the fundamentals of politics. It's a very clever move, there's no question about this. The political sphere provides us with its own far-reaching normative criteria. So Williams insists that the Hobbesian quest for order and security always immediately points, in ways that perhaps Hobbes did not sufficiently see, to all sorts of controversial normative questions, which call out for answers. In his terms, state power must always meet what he describes as a basic legitimation demand, which requires of it that it provide a plausible justification to everyone who becomes subject to coercive power, the state power. Williams argues that this basic legitimation demand excludes disadvantaging some people such that it might become difficult to see how, in fact, their status is different from those who lack basic state protection. It excludes, he says, one lot of people terrorizing another lot of people. Why? Because the whole point of politics, this is sort of the gist of the argument, in the first place, supposedly, is to avoid disorder and violence. He argues that under modern conditions, basic legitimation requires that states respect the fundamentals of modern liberalism, even some basic human rights. Prohibition on torture, for example, can be deduced from it because they can be directly justified by the Obesian quest for order and security. So he's much more sympathetic towards some basic human rights and voices. But the most important thing is that the basic intuition here is that you can get a lot of normative mileage out of Hobbes' familiar view that order and security represent paramount goods. For Williams, many desirable normative aspirations are simply, he says again, inherent in there being such a thing as politics in the first place. Why? Well, because for him, unmitigated coercion, violence, these are not per se political situations. They are rather the situations, again his words, which the existence of the political is in the first place supposed to alleviate. End of quote. Unfortunately, I'm not convinced that this otherwise very clever and in some ways I think quite appealing argument ultimately really works. If, for example, politics is about conflicts between friends and enemies, and this is what Williams says, he starts with that insight, why exclude a priori the familiar possibility that these conflicts might take a life or death form, as they often have historically, and thus that they might entail some groups terrorizing other groups. When we try to circumvent political violence, we do so at least implicitly because of independent moral reasons, for example, fundamental respect for other human beings as moral equals, call for us to do so. The mere fact that politics is concerned with guaranteeing order and security does not, in my view, suffice. Most obviously, perhaps, the simple reason that the creation of political order typically means creating external others who do not enjoy its protections and may in fact come to be seen as threats to it comes to mind. We are outraged by state torture not chiefly because it challenges the preconditions of political order. In some rare and tragic circumstances, unfortunately, it may be essential to political order, but instead because it conflicts with core moral intuitions that we have for all sorts of different reasons we could talk about. In other words, there's nothing, in my view, against Williams' internal, imminent to the political condition which requires of us to criticize, let's say, violence or torture. In the final analysis, I think Williams solves the paradoxes generated by conceiving of politics as an independent sphere of action by smuggling ethics and morality into his definition of it. Even if this is an admirable way to go, I think it is a morally admirable way to go, but in some ways politically admirable way to go, I don't think he has justified his grounds for doing so. Like Morgenthau, Williams is eager both to acknowledge the autonomy of politics and to avoid an amoral realism. I think that's, again, a sympathetic move. But because he's bought into this peculiar notion that politics represents a separate or distinctive sphere of activity, unrestrained by external moral or ethical imperatives, his account of the relationship between morality and politics, I think, ultimately proves no more satisfactory. For reasons I cannot get into, I think it's actually less satisfactory in some respects. On the crucial matter of political ethics, as on so many other important questions, the new realists have not advanced much, if at all, beyond mid-century IR realism, even though they continue to ignore it. There still, I think, might be a thing or two they could learn from Morgenthau